I'm now going to read a similar story, this one from the book of Matthew. And this is a story about when Jesus took Peter and the sons of Zebedee up a mountain. And Moses and Elijah, they're already there, as is God. So reading now from Matthew 17, verses 1 to 9. Listen for the word of God for you. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and the brothers James and John and led them up a high mountain where they were alone. As they looked on, a change came over Jesus. His face was shining like the sun, and his clothes were dazzling white. Then the 3 disciples saw Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. So Peter spoke up and said to Jesus, "Lord, how good it is that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was talking, a shining cloud came over them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard the voice, they were so terrified that they threw themselves face downward on the ground. Jesus came to them and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." So they looked up and saw no one there but Jesus. As they came down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Don't tell anyone about this vision you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from death." The 2 stories we heard this morning are alike in so many ways. Moses and Jesus each climb a mountain. Clouds appear. Light shines. God's voice thunders from within the clouds. To the people gathered below Mount Sinai, where Moses is at, the light looks like fire burning on the mountaintop. To the disciples who are with Jesus on his mountain, the light seems to radiate both from within the cloud and from Jesus' face. Interestingly, if you read Exodus chapter 34, which follows later after this first passage we read, Moses' face also shines like the sun after he encounters God. Not only are the stories similar in their details, but in Matthew's story, Moses himself, in the flesh, and over 1,000 years after his death, appears with Elijah, also previously dead, on the mountain where Jesus is at. And Jesus' disciples see these 2 heavyweights of the Jewish faith talking with Jesus. Now, I believe Matthew is a brilliant preacher. His audience is Jewish, and so for him to link Jesus to Moses the way he has is pure genius for getting his audience to accept Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, Son of Man. Now, before we continue, let's put to rest a question that may be on your minds. And that is, did these stories actually occur? In other words, are these stories factually true? We ask the question because science and logic, for better or for worse, are the hallmarks of the Western culture. And they demand that the stories we tell, including those in our sacred texts, conform to provable facts. That's our culture. Let's face it, as a society, we worship the great God. Fact. Right? So much so that anything less than factual, we classify as a myth and then promptly dismiss it. It's what we do. We say to ourselves, if I am to believe this or that, if I am to find any truth or any lesson in it, then at the very least, it must be factually true. And so with respect to Bible stories, we're inclined to assume that they are factually true. Right? Otherwise, how could we ever believe on any level the stories we want so much to believe? Now, that being said, personally, I highly doubt that these stories we read today are factually true. On the other hand, I believe they contain so much truth at a deeper spiritual level that we would be foolish to dismiss them. Now, I hope that you can see that Matthew's sermon is shaped by the Moses figure. Just as Moses is once threatened by Pharaoh, Jesus is threatened by Herod. Just as Moses receives the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, Jesus interprets these same commandments in his Sermon on the Mount. Matthew is brilliant. He knows that for his Jewish audience to accept Jesus as their Messiah, they will first have to see Jesus coming out of a long line of Jewish heavyweights. But the pure genius of Matthew's preaching starts in verse 6, which reads, "When the disciples heard God's voice coming from the cloud, they were so terrified, they threw themselves face downward on the ground." This verse echoes the terror the Israelites of Moses' time felt. When hearing the voice of God, they cried out to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we will die." They felt genuine terror. The real deal. The Israelites in Moses' time and the disciples in Jesus' time were deathly afraid when they heard God's voice. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt not the gentle touch of the God you were expecting, but rather the awesome, impossible to withstand, electrified power of God? You ever felt it? I have once in my life. And I'd like to at least try and describe that experience to you. Now, some of you have heard the story before, and I apologize for that. But I have to tell the story again, because it illustrates the point I'm trying to make so well. And besides, there are some new members here, right, that haven't heard the story before. So this is going out to them. In 2002, my mother-in-law, Dorothy, came to live with Susan and I. She was 83 years old and dying of cancer. She also suffered from COPD and was forced to draw short breaths of air from an oxygen tank she dragged everywhere she went. From anywhere in the house, it seemed, you could hear the squeak of the aluminum wheels as Dorothy dragged her cart from room to room. And with each pull of the cart, she would have to yank that plastic tubing that joined her lungs to the tank. What often followed was a short outburst, sometimes a curse, when the tubing got caught beneath a door or around a piece of furniture. Yes, Susan, she did curse. I heard it. One night when we were all sleeping, Sue and I heard a loud moan. We both jumped from the bed at precisely the same instant. It's uncanny. And we found Dorothy sprawled on the floor. She had been on her way to the bathroom when she became entangled in her plastic tubing and tripped. She wasn't hurt as much as she was angry. Angry at what she thought was her own clumsiness. More angry, perhaps, at a situation she knew would never improve. We helped Dorothy back to bed and assured her that no one, not a single soul, could ever master walking in the dark in a house not their own. With 20 feet of plastic tubing tangled around their feet. I couldn't do it. Sooner or later, everyone would trip. Dorothy bought the argument, at least for our sake, but probably not for hers. When we got back to bed, I lay on my back, not twitching a muscle. I just lay there. My arms were glued to my sides. My legs were stiff and unyielding, stretching out in some vain attempt to reach the end of the bed. I lay quietly thinking, loving, pitying, when all of a sudden I felt a surge of power I had never felt before or since. Like electricity, but not. A power. Or what I think now was some mysterious presence, filling every cell in my body, it seemed. From the tips of my toes to the hairs on my head. Pure, unharnessed power. Uncontrollable, unyielding. Not moving out or away from me. Just holding its own. Not quite prepared to release its grip on me. I was afraid. Rather, I was terrified. Soon I began to think that this force, this energy, this consciousness, or whatever else you want to call it, could be none other than the God of the universe. Still, I was terrified. I was deathly afraid of that power. So much so that I cried out to God to release me, to let me be, to let me recover somehow from the frightening experience. Kind of odd, coming from a clergyman. But like the disciples in Matthew's passage, I was so afraid, I felt like throwing myself face down on the ground. The experience would end only after God, through Susan, placed her hand gently on my chest, and she calmed my frantic breathing. I can only guess that the terror I felt that night was the same as what the disciples felt when they were up on the mountain with Jesus. But terrified as they were, Jesus came to the disciples and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Do not be afraid." Right? To the disciples who are overwhelmed by the presence and the voice of God, Jesus reaches out his hand and touches them and reassures them, saying, "Do not be afraid." The Israelites in Moses' time, fearing they would die if God spoke to them. Jesus' disciples collapsing face down on the ground when they heard God's voice from within the cloud. I can relate to that. Oh, I can. I felt that fear. That's raw fear, trust me. And like the disciples who felt God's touch through Jesus, I felt God's reassuring touch, I believe, through Susan. As if God were saying to me, "Be calm. Do not be afraid." Does anything banish our fears more perfectly than the simple human touch? For me, this is the great genius of God. God, who made the heavens and the earth and all that is in them, God whose greatness is so vast that not even the heavens above or the heavens below can contain it. God whose children we are is so magnificent, he is willing to come among us, reach out, touch us, and still our fears. Great genius of God. Jesus' hand on the shoulders of the disciples, Susan's hand on my beating chest, for me is nothing less than God's own touch. And I tell you from experience, anything more would be too much. And that, for me, is the deeper meaning and lesson to be found in the Transfiguration passage. It's what I see in the bright, shining face of Jesus. Moses was first transfigured from a simple desert leader to a giver of God's law. Jesus was transfigured 1,000 years later from a young carpenter to a prophet, rabbi, and teacher, to God's Messiah and man's interpreter of God's law. A son of man and a son of God. And equally as important, you might say that God is transfigured. God is transfigured in the way that Jesus touches and reassures his disciples, including you and me. Because our understandings of God are transfigured or transformed. Eh? God's face for us forever changed. Jesus shows us that God is not the wrathful, vengeful distributor of punishment that we think he is. God is not the judge and hangman that we ought to fear. Jesus, I think, shows a more accurate image of God that he wants us to have. Jesus sees God not as a wrathful king, but as a healer. Not a divine warrior, but a lover. Not a vengeful, bloodthirsty, punishing judge in front of whom we are wise to cringe, but instead a great power for good, able to form a universe, while at the same time a caring, compassionate, merciful, and awesome wonder. Right? Whose gentle touch forever tells us, get up. Do not be afraid. That's the God who loves you and me. Is there anything more beautiful?